I'm very pleased to welcome you. I know this is the first week of classes for the students here. Can I just have a show of hands of how many first-year students are here? Okay. Harry, is that better? Yeah, great. So good. We have a good number of first-year students. That's excellent. My name is Sonu Bedi. I'm the relatively new appointed director of the Ethics Institute here at Dartmouth. I'm also an associate professor in the government department. I teach courses in constitutional law and political theory. And so I'll just do a shameless plug. I'm teaching constitutional law development and theory in the winter 2018 and a seminar on contemporary readings in justice. Academics always shamelessly plug, right? So, okay. This is part of the Dorsett Fellowship. Let me just say a bit about that. So the Dorsett Fellowship was established in 2001 when the Frederick Gardner Foundation, in conjunction with the Research Corporation Technologies, made a significant donation in honor of Bert Dorsett, class of '53, establishing this endowed fund. The purpose of the fund is to honor the exemplary business career of Bert Dorsett by bringing practitioners of ethics from various fields, lawyers, business leaders, physicians, engineers, and/or scholars of ethics to the Dartmouth campus. Usually we have a representative from the Dorsett family here, but unfortunately Debbie Dorsett, Bert's daughter, could not make it, but sends her regards. And this year what we're doing is something distinctive. Oftentimes for the Dartmouth students here, those who are not first-year students know this, each term seems to be its own little thing, and then like when that term is done, we're gonna move on to the next term. So what I've established for this academic year is the Dorsett Lecture Series, and the topic is free speech on college campuses. And what we're going to do is bring a speaker each term to campus to talk about free speech from a different perspective. And as you all may or may not know, this is a hot button issue, right? Thinking about free speech on college campuses. Do restrictions on free speech inform academic freedom, undermine academic freedom? What do we do when we're competing with freedom of speech versus commitments to equality? So those are some of the questions that this lecture series is going to seek to answer, or at least consider. Of course, today, I couldn't be happier about having Professor Geoffrey Stone be our first speaker. Just so you know, in the winter, we will have Jelani Cobb from Columbia University, and then Robert Post from Yale Law School in the spring. So our speaker today, and this is my real pleasure to introduce the fall Dorsett Lecture Fellow, is Professor Geoffrey Stone, who's the Edward H. Levy Distinguished Service Professor at the University of Chicago Law School. Now, let me say that Professor Stone has a kind of enviable academic record, right? That all academics, wish they had, right? He has a Supreme Court clerkship, right? He's a public intellectual, prolific scholar. Actually, the reason I know about his work is that I assign it in my classes. So I knew it even before I even thought about having a lecture series on free speech. And he's written, obviously, many op-eds. He wrote an op-ed in the New York Times on freedom of speech. And so he is really couldn't have think of a better person to deliver this first lecture. And just so you have a background, he did his undergraduate degree at Wharton. He did his law degree from the University of Chicago, where he's editor-in-chief of the Law Review. I mean, he has over 40 books, over 100 law reviews. And his work really spans the full range of constitutional law and civil liberties, not just freedom of speech, of which he's an expert, but also religion, gay rights, reproductive rights. I will say that his newest book, published, I think, March of this year, is called Sex and the Constitution, Sex, Religion, and Law from America's Origins to the 21st Century. It's 704 pages. I admit I have not, is that right? Did I get that? I have not gotten through all of it. But I'm just going to give you one line from it, okay? It's like a teaser trailer, right? Quote, as in England at this time, colonial bookstores in the 18th century contained an amazing variety of erotica, okay? So he starts off, right, from actually goes all the way to ancient Greece and, thinks about issues of sex in colonial America and how we should think of it in terms of the Constitution. I mean, so the range of this book, I really encourage you to check it out. He's, as I said, written a casebook on the First Amendment, on free speech. I've used it in my class on free speech. He was appointed by President Obama to serve on the President's Review Group on Intelligence and Communications Technologies, which evaluated the government's foreign intelligence surveillance program in the wake of the leaks by Edward Snowden. He's a fellow of the Academy of Arts and Sciences, a member of the American Law Institute, the National Advisory Council of the ACLU, a member of the American Philosophical Society, and member of the Board of Advisors of the Council for Democracy and Technology. He's also filed various amicus briefs in important constitutional cases. He was telling students about that earlier today at the student lunch, which we had a great turnout. And he was actually one of the lawyers that represented Bill Clinton in the Supreme Court Clinton v. Jones, the Paula Jones case. So that's interesting. Hopefully we can talk about that over dinner, right? Okay. And most relevant to this lecture today, he chaired University of Chicago's Committee on Free Expression in 2014. And that committee produced a report that really is the go-to report for thinking about freedom of speech on college campuses. And so, again, couldn't be happier that we have Professor Stone here to deliver the Dorsett lecture. And you know what? I'm going to the title, I did not write down the title of his talk. I'll just say it now, right? I totally forgot that on my notes here, but I will say it has free speech in the title, and so let's, so with that, Professor Stone.
Thank you for that introduction. The name of the talk is Free Speech on Campus, a Challenge for Our Times. So after looking at over this audience, I expected an audience of students, and I see many of my contemporaries here, which is kind of fun. But I hope those of you who are my contemporaries will excuse the fact that at moments I'm clearly talking to the students themselves. So whenever I speak to students, particularly near the beginning of the academic year, I can't help but recall an incident involving Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. At the time of this incident, Holmes was a very old man, nearing 90 years of age, in the autumn of his very long and very distinguished career on the Supreme Court of the United States. Now, on this particular occasion, Holmes was on a train headed north from Washington, and he was deeply engrossed in reading a legal brief when the conductor knocked on the door to his compartment. Recognizing Holmes, the conductor respectfully asked for his ticket. Holmes looked in his coat pocket, no ticket. He looked in his vest pocket, no ticket. He reached into his trouser pocket, no ticket. Growing ever more frantic, Holmes began rummaging desperately through his briefcase, but still, no ticket. At this point, the conductor, trying to calm Holmes down, said, "Never mind, Mr. Justice. It's really not a problem. When you find the ticket, you can just mail it into the company." To which Holmes exploded, "You dolt. I don't give a damn about your ticket. I just want to know where the hell I'm supposed to be going." Now, as a student, particularly a first-year student, you must often feel a bit like Justice Holmes. You want to know where the hell you're supposed to be going. Well, my task today is to offer at least some sense of direction. I'd like to begin by telling you a bit about my world. It is the world of the law. More specifically, it is the world of constitutional law. Law is about stories. It is about real people involved in real disputes with real consequences. So I shall tell you a story. This story begins during World War I. As you may or may not know, World War I was not a particularly popular war with the American people, whose sympathies were divided. Many Americans vigorously opposed the Wilson administration's decision to intervene in the brutal conflict that was then raging in Europe, arguing that our intervention was both unwise and immoral. Not surprisingly, such opposition did not sit well with the government. In 1917, Attorney General Thomas Gregory, attacking the loyalty of war opponents, declared, quote, "May God have mercy on them, for they can expect none from an avenging government." Gregory wasn't kidding about the avenging government. In 1918, Congress enacted the Sedition Act, which made it a crime for any person to utter any disloyal, scurrilous, or abusive language intended to cause contempt for the government of the United States, the Constitution, the military, or the flag. True to the Attorney General's threat, federal authorities launched more than 2,000 prosecutions against individuals who wrote or spoke against the war or the draft. Now, one such prosecution involved 5 young Russian Jewish immigrants who were then roughly your age, that is the age of the students, not of my contemporaries, at the time. In the summer of 1918, the United States sent a contingent of Marines to Vladivostok in Russia. Fearing that this was the first step in an American effort to crush the Russian Revolution, these 5 self-proclaimed socialists threw several thousand copies of each of 2 leaflets, one in English, the other in Yiddish, from several rooftops on the Lower East Side of New York City. The leaflets, which were boldly signed "The Rebels," were addressed to other Russian immigrants. After stating that the rebels hated German militarism, they warned that those who worked in ammunition factories were producing bullets, bayonets, and cannon to murder not only the Germans, but also your dearest, your best, who were in Russia and who were fighting for their freedom. The rebels were immediately arrested by the military police. After a controversial trial, they were convicted of violating the Sedition Act of 1918. The trial judge, disgusted by their behavior and their beliefs, sentenced the rebels to terms ranging up to 20 years in prison. The rebels appealed their convictions to the Supreme Court of the United States, claiming that their convictions violated the First Amendment, which guarantees that, quote, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. In Abrams versus United States, the Supreme Court, in a 7-2 decision, rejected this claim and upheld their convictions. For the majority of the court, this was an easy case. Because the natural tendency of the defendant's speech was to generate opposition to the war and therefore interfere with the war effort, it was not within, quote, the freedom of speech protected by the Constitution. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, the same Justice Holmes who some years later was to lose his railway ticket, dissented. Holmes' dissenting opinion in Abrams is worth reading, for it remains one of the most eloquent statements ever written by a justice of the Supreme Court about the freedom of expression. Holmes wrote, quote, persecution for the expression of opinion seems to me perfectly logical. If you have no doubt of your premises and want a certain result with all your heart, then you naturally want to sweep away all opposition. But, he added, when men have realized that time has upset many fighting faiths, they may come to believe that the ultimate good desired is better reached by free trade in ideas, that the best test of truth is the power of the thought to get itself accepted in the competition of the market, and that truth is the only ground upon which our wishes can safely be carried out. Holmes therefore concluded that we should be eternally vigilant against attempts to check the expression even of opinions that we loathe and believe to be fraught with death, unless they so imminently threaten competing government interests that an immediate check is necessary to save the nation. Now, I first read this passage, written almost a century ago, when I was a law student at the University of Chicago, almost half a century ago. It has engaged my energy and curiosity ever since. Indeed, I think it's fair to say that it was my puzzling over this passage that, for better or worse, put me on the path to my career, and indeed to where I stand before you today. But now I must change direction, for this is not to be a discourse on the First Amendment. It is rather to be a talk about academic freedom. Now, happily, these are not unrelated subjects. To the contrary, the longer I've puzzled over the meaning of free expression, and the longer I've thought about education, the more the two seem to me to converge. Indeed, neither is really worth all that much without the other. And with that in mind, I'd like to turn to what I see as the intersection of free expression and education, and to the subject of academic freedom. For it's at this intersection that we'll find the most fundamental values of the world of education. Now, I hope to accomplish two things in this part of my talk. First, I'll trace briefly for you the history of academic freedom, for it's only by understanding where we've been that we can appreciate, in both senses of that word, where we are today. It's important, and second, I'll offer some thoughts about what all of this means for you that is, the students in particular, and about the responsibilities that we today, that means all of us, bear in common. Now, it's important to understand that, like the freedom of speech, academic freedom is not a law of nature. It does not exist of its own force. It is always vulnerable and should never be taken for granted. Indeed, until well into the 19th century, real freedom of thought was neither practiced nor professed in American colleges. To the contrary, any real freedom of inquiry or expression in American colleges in this era was smothered by the dominance of religion and by the prevailing theory of doctrinal moralism, which assumed that the worth of an idea must be judged by what the institution's leaders declared its moral value to be. Thus, through the first half of the 19th century, American colleges squelched any notion of free and open discussion or intellectual curiosity. Any student or faculty member who dared argue, for example, that women were equal to men, that blacks were equal to whites, or that homosexuality was not immoral, would surely be expelled or fired without hesitation. Similarly, through the first half of the 19th century, as the nation moved towards civil war, any professor or student in the North who openly defended slavery, or any professor or student in the South who openly challenged slavery, could readily be dismissed, disciplined, or expelled. When a professor at the University of North Carolina expressed sympathy for the 1856 Republican presidential candidate, the students burned him in effigy, and he was dismissed by the Board of Trustees. When a professor at Franklin College in Pennsylvania admitted he was not an abolitionist, he was promptly fired. Several decades later, a furious battle arose over Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, with traditionalists charging not only that Darwin was wrong, but also that his beliefs were dangerous, immoral, and ungodly. As a consequence of this conflict in the academy over evolution versus creationism, new academic goals came to be embraced. For the first time, to criticize as well as to preserve traditional moral values and understandings became an accepted function of higher education. And by 1892, William Rainey Harper, the first president of the University of Chicago, could boldly assert, quote, "When for any reason the administration of a university attempts to dislodge a professor or punish a student because of his political or religious sentiments, at that moment the institution has ceased to be a university." But despite such noble sentiments, the battle for academic freedom has been a continuing and fiercely contentious one. In the closing years of the 19th century, businessmen who had accumulated vast industrial wealth began to support colleges and universities on an unprecedented scale. But that support was not without strings. And during this era, professors who offended wealthy donors by criticizing their business practices were dismissed from such leading institutions as Cornell and Stanford. Then, during World War I, patriotic zealots persecuted and, as we've seen, even prosecuted those who questioned the wisdom or morality of the war. In the face of such outrage, universities collapsed almost completely in their defense of academic freedom. Students and professors were systematically expelled and fired as colleges and universities across the nation, merely for encouraging a spirit of indifference towards the war. Similar issues arose again with a vengeance during the Cold War in the age of Joseph McCarthy. In the 1940s and 1950s, most colleges and universities excluded those even suspected of communist sympathies from university life. Yale President Charles Seymour, for example, went so far as to boast that, quote, "There will be no witch hunts at Yale because there will be no witches. We will neither admit nor hire anyone with communist sympathies." As this history demonstrates, the freedom to question, the freedom to challenge, the freedom to inquire are not to be taken for granted. Academic freedom is, in fact, a hard-bought acquisition in an endless struggle to preserve the right of each individual, student and faculty alike, to seek wisdom, knowledge, and truth, free of the censor's sword. But what does all of this have to do with you? Well, in a radio address to America in 1931, the Irish playwright George Bernard Shaw startled his audience with the following proposition. He said, "Every person who owes his life to civilized society and who has enjoyed its very costly protections and advantages should appear at reasonable intervals before a properly qualified jury to justify his existence, which should be summarily but painlessly terminated if he fails to justify it." Now, I do not advocate such a program, but I do suggest that every one of us who enjoys the protections and advantages of our hard-won system of academic freedom has a responsibility to justify his or her existence under it. Now, there are several ways in which we can meet this responsibility. First, we must defend academic freedom when it comes under attack. Like every liberty that is precious to us, the preservation of academic freedom demands vigilance, determination, and sometimes courage. Second, we must struggle to define the meaning of academic freedom in our time. As we saw in Abrams, the Constitution's guarantee of freedom of speech is not self-defining. Neither is academic freedom. Each generation must give life to this concept in the face of the distinctive conflicts that arise over time. Today, the principal challenge to academic freedom comes not from outside the university, but from within it, primarily from students themselves, some of whom demand censorship of ideas that they find distasteful and offensive, and from faculty members and administrators who, afraid to disappoint their students, too often surrender academic freedom to charges of offense. Now, to give just a few examples, several colleges and universities, including Johns Hopkins, Brown, and Williams, have recently withdrawn speaker invitations because of student objections to the views of the invited speakers. Northwestern University recently subjected a professor to a sustained sexual harassment investigation for publishing an essay in the Chronicle of Higher Education that criticized Northwestern's sexual harassment investigations. Colorado College suspended a student for making a joke that mocked feminism. The State University of New York denied promotion to a professor who criticized the university's affirmative action program. William and Mary and the University of Colorado disciplined students for criticizing their affirmative action programs. Students at Vanderbilt demanded that a tenured faculty member be fired for writing an op-ed in which she raised questions about Islam and violence. The University of Kansas disciplined a professor for mocking the National Rifle Association. LSU fired a professor because some of her women students complained that they'd been made to feel uncomfortable by her use of profanity in class. At Wesleyan University, after the school newspaper published a student op-ed criticizing the Black Lives Matter movement, students demanded that the university defund the school paper. At Amherst College, students demanded that the administration remove posters stating that all lives matter. At Emory University, students demanded that other students who had chalked Trump in 2016 on the university's sidewalks should be punished because, in their words, a university is supposed to be a safe place for students, and this made us feel unsafe. And at a number of institutions, including DePaul, Claremont McKenna, the University of California, Irvine, San Francisco State, the University of Pennsylvania, Middlebury College, and others, students physically obstructed access to venues or shouted down speakers whose views they opposed, causing those events to be canceled. To put all this in perspective, a recent survey revealed that 72% of current college students support disciplinary action against any student or faculty member who expresses views deemed by them to be racist, sexist, homophobic, or otherwise offensive. So, where did all this come from? It was not too long ago when students were demanding the right to free speech. Now, at least some students demand the right to be free from speech that they find to be offensive, upsetting, or emotionally disturbing. What explains this profound shift in attitude? Well, one oft-expressed theory is at least some members of this generation of students have been raised by so-called helicopter parents who protected and celebrated them in every way, shielding them at every turn from the risks of failure, frustration, and defeat. On this theory, these students, unlike their predecessors, have never learned to deal effectively with challenge, uncertainty, insult, or fear. They therefore demand the right to be protected from speech that they find to be offensive, hurtful, or demeaning. If this is so, then the proper role of an institution of higher learning is not to shield those students from distressing or offensive ideas, but to prepare them for the challenges of the real world. The goal of a university should not be to insulate students from discomfort and insecurity, but to enable them to be strong and effective citizens of the world, a world that will not shield them from such expression. Now, another possible explanation of the current situation is that this generation of students is more attuned than their predecessors to the injustices of society, to the harmful impact of hateful expression, and to the inequalities that poison our nation. To the extent that this is so, then it might be in part to the creation of social media. When I was the age of current students, we were rarely exposed to truly hateful expression. The media never carried it, and although we knew it existed and might sometimes confront it in a locker room or something, for the most part, it was rare. The world of social media, however, has changed all that. Today, it is difficult not to encounter hateful expression. On this view of the matter, students today are not timid, but bold. They seek not shelter, but justice. They understand the ugliness of such expression, and they want to protect both themselves and their classmates from the vitriol that now poisons some forms of expression. Still, another possible explanation is that some students, particularly those who come from disadvantaged, marginalized, and discriminated against backgrounds, have always felt unwelcome on college campuses, but in the past, they simply remained silent. On this view of the matter, this generation of students, particularly those who themselves feel unwelcome and alienated, deserve credit, because instead of remaining silent in the face of oppression, they have the courage to demand equality and respect. My own view, for what it's worth, is that there is an element of truth in all of these perspectives, and others, no doubt, as well. The question is what to do about it. Now, faced with the ongoing challenge to academic freedom in American universities, in 2014, University of Chicago President Robert Zimmer charged a faculty committee with the task of drafting a formal statement for the University of Chicago on freedom of expression, as you heard in my introduction. The goal of that committee, which I chaired, was to stake out our university's position on these issues. The committee consisted of 7 distinguished faculty members from across the university, and after broad consultation, we produced a brief 3-page report. And at the risk of being self-indulgent, I want to read to you some excerpts from that report. Quote, "Because the University of Chicago is committed to free and open inquiry in all matters, it guarantees all members of our community the broadest possible latitude to speak, write, listen, challenge, and learn. Except insofar as limitations on that freedom are necessary to the functioning of the University of Chicago fully respects and supports the freedom of all members of our community to discuss any problem that presents itself. Of course, the ideas of different members of the university community will often and quite naturally conflict, but it is not the proper role of the university to attempt to shield individuals from ideas and opinions that they find unwelcome, disagreeable, or even deeply offensive. Although the university greatly values civility, and although all members of the university community share in the responsibility for maintaining a climate of mutual respect, concerns about civility and mutual respect can never be used as a justification for closing off the discussion of ideas, however offensive or disagreeable those ideas may be. The freedom to debate and to discuss the merits of competing ideas does not, of course, mean that individuals may say whatever they wish, wherever they wish. The university may restrict expression that violates the law, that falsely defames a specific individual, that constitutes a genuine threat or harassment, that unjustifiably invades substantial privacy or confidentiality interests, or that is otherwise directly incompatible with the core functioning of the university. But these are narrow exceptions to the general principle of freedom of expression, and it is vitally important that these exceptions never be used in a manner that is inconsistent with the university's commitment to a completely free and open discussion of ideas. In a word, the university's fundamental commitment is to the principle that debate or deliberation may not be suppressed because the ideas put forth are thought by some or even by most members of the university community to be offensive, unwise, immoral, or wrong-headed. It is for the individual members of the university community, not for the university as an institution, to make those judgments for themselves and to act on those judgments not by seeking to suppress speech, but by openly and vigorously contesting the ideas that they oppose. Indeed, fostering the ability of members of the university community to engage in such debate and deliberation in an effective and responsible manner is an essential part of the university's educational mission. As a corollary to the university's commitment to protect and promote free expression, members of the university community must also act in conformity with the principle of free expression. Although members of the university community are free to criticize and contest the views expressed on campus, and to criticize and contest speakers who are invited to express their views on campus, they may not obstruct or otherwise interfere with the freedom of others to express views that they happen to reject or loathe. To this end, the university has a solemn responsibility not only to promote a lively and fearless freedom of debate and deliberation, but also to protect that freedom when others attempt to restrict it. Now, interestingly, when we wrote this report, we were thinking only about the University of Chicago. Indeed, the first page really was just a description of the history of the University of Chicago in conflicts that had occurred in the past. And we then went on to the language, some of which I just read. To our surprise then, the report has had a national and even international impact. A number of universities have figured out they can simply lop off the first page and just use the rest of the report. And indeed, that part of the report has now been adopted by a range of other colleges and universities, including such diverse institutions as Princeton, Columbia, the University of Minnesota, the University of Missouri, Purdue, Johns Hopkins, American University, the University of Wisconsin, and a number of others. Okay, now that I've finished congratulating myself, let me elaborate just a bit. Why should a university take the position that faculty and students should be free to advance any and all ideas, however offensive, obnoxious, and wrong-headed they might be? Well, first, one thing we have learned from bitter experience is that even the ideas we hold to be most certain might in fact turn out to be wrong. As confident as we might be in our own wisdom, experience teaches that certainty is different from truth. If those who believed with absolute certainty that the earth was the center of the universe were wrong, if those who believed with absolute certainty in creationism were wrong, if those who believed that slavery was natural, right, and proper were wrong, if those who believed that a woman's place is in the home were wrong, if those who believed that homosexuals were degraded perverts were wrong, then why should we have the arrogance to think that we are unquestionably right about our own beliefs? The only wise approach, as Justice Holmes made clear, is to acknowledge the risk that our certainties might be wrong as well, and that they too must always be open to challenge and to question. Second, experience teaches that the suppression of speech breeds the suppression of speech. If today I am permitted to silence those whose views I find distasteful, I have then opened the door to others down the road to silence me. The neutral principle of no suppression of ideas protects us all. And this is especially important in the current situation. For in the long run, it is likely to be minorities, whether religious minorities, racial minorities, or political minorities, who are most likely to be silenced once censorship is deemed acceptable. Indeed, without a vibrant commitment to freedom of speech, our nation would never have seen a civil rights movement, a women's rights movement, or a gay rights movement, all of which would have been suppressed by intolerant majorities. Censorship, in short, is never a one-way street, and this is a door we do not want to open, particularly perhaps in the era of Trump. Indeed, it is important to remember that a robust protection of free speech is especially important to dissenters and to minorities, because if censorship is permitted, it is ultimately they who are most likely in the long run to suffer. Third, a central precept of free expression is the concern with the chilling effect. That is, this problem is especially acute today because of the effects of social media. It used to be the case that students and faculty members were willing to take controversial positions in debate, in classroom, in the dorms, in part because the risks of doing so were relatively modest. One could say something provocative or outrageous, and the statement was soon forgotten and disappeared from view. But in a world of social media, where every comment you make can be circulated to the world, and it can be called up later by prospective employers or graduate schools or neighbors or prospective dates with the mere click of a button, the potential cost of speaking courageously, of taking controversial positions, of taking risks, is greater than ever before in history. Indeed, according to a recent survey, 65% of all college students now say that it is unsafe for them to express unpopular views. And this clearly has had an effect on faculty as well. In this setting, it is especially important for institutions of higher learning to stand up for free expression. So how should this work in practice? Should students, faculty, and other speakers be allowed to express whatever views they want, however offensive they might be to others? Yes, absolutely. Should those who disagree and are offended by the views and speech of others be allowed to condemn those views and those speakers in the most vehement terms? Yes, absolutely. Should students, faculty, and community members who oppose a speaker be permitted to disrupt an event in order to prevent that individual from speaking? Absolutely not. Although non-disruptive protests are both permitted and encouraged, disruption of the rights of others to speak and to listen is wholly incompatible with the central principle of academic freedom. Should those who were offended and who disagree with the views of others be allowed to demand that the institution should punish those who have offended them? Yes, absolutely. Should a university punish those whose speech annoys, offends, or insults others? Absolutely not. So what, though, should a university do? First, a university should educate its students and faculty about the importance of civility and mutual respect. As a former student of mine wrote to me recently, a university has an obligation to create a community of people as well as a community of ideas, a place where everyone feels certain that they are unambiguously welcome. This must be a core institutional value, but it is a value that must be reinforced and reaffirmed by education and by example, not by censorship. Second, a university should encourage free, open, and robust disagreement, argument, and debate. It should educate its students about the history, the importance, and the fragility of free speech. And it should instill in its students and faculty the importance of winning the day by facts, by ideas, and by persuasion, rather than by force, disruption, or censorship. Indeed, for an institution of higher education to fulfill its most fundamental mission, it must be a safe space for even the most loathsome, offensive, and disloyal arguments. As a former colleague of mine at the University of Chicago Law School, who stepped down 8 months ago as President of the United States, observed in a recent commencement address, no matter how much you might disagree with certain speakers, don't try to shut them down. Let them talk, but have the confidence to challenge them. If the other side has a point, learn from them. If they're wrong, rebut them. Beat them on the battlefield of ideas. And you might as well start practicing now, because one thing I can guarantee you, you will have to deal with ignorance, hatred, racism, and stupidity at every stage of your life. That was a man who certainly can justify that statement. Third, a university must recognize that our society, being flawed as it is, the cost of free speech will often fall most heavily on those groups and individuals who feel the most marginalized, unwelcome, and disrespected. Now, all of us feel that way sometimes, of course, but in our often unjust society, the individuals who most often bear the brunt of free speech, or at least of certain types of free speech, tend to be racial and ethnic minorities, religious minorities, women, gays, lesbians, and transsexuals, immigrants, ideological dissidents, and the like. Colleges and universities must be sensitive to this reality. Even if they cannot solve this problem by censorship, they can and should take other steps to address the special challenges faced by students and by groups who are most often made to feel unwelcome and unvalued by others. Institutions of higher education must take this challenge seriously. They should encourage civility and mutual respect. They should support students who feel vulnerable, marginalized, silenced, and demeaned. They should help those students learn how to speak up, how to respond effectively, how to challenge those whose attitudes, whose words, and whose beliefs offend, appall, and outrage them. This is a core responsibility of our institutions, for the world is not a safe space, and it is a job of our universities and colleges to enable our graduates to win the battles they will need to fight in the years and in the decades to come. This is not a challenge that colleges can or should ignore. Now, speaking of the responsibility of colleges and universities, I should address one other critical facet of these issues. Suppose those who oppose a speaker, whether they be students, faculty, or community members, disregard their responsibility to respect the freedom of speech and threaten violence or otherwise disrupt an event in order to prevent an invited speaker from speaking. What should the institution do? After the events of Charlottesville, this is an especially important question. The simple solution is for the institution to play it safe and just to refuse to permit the speaker to come to campus. Indeed, this is the approach several institutions have now adopted. The University of Florida and Texas A&M, for example, have recently announced that they will not permit alt-right leader Richard Spencer to speak on campus for fear of disruption and even violence. But if universities adopt this approach and thus empower those who oppose the speaker to prevent the event from taking place merely by threatening disruption or violence, what will happen? Such a response will inevitably encourage others who want to exclude speakers to adopt the same strategy, knowing that they too can shut down the speech they oppose merely by threatening disruption or violence. This invites what the Supreme Court has called the heckler's veto. Such a course invites other groups to wield the power of censorship over whatever views they wish to suppress, whether those views be anti-war, pro-Black Lives Matter, anti-immigration, pro-Israel, anti-Trump, pro-abortion, anti-affirmative action, pro-gay rights, or whatever. In effect, the heckler's veto turns the right to free speech over to those who oppose the ideas being espoused. It's noteworthy by the Supreme Court it's noteworthy, by the way, that the Supreme Court first learned the lesson of the heckler's veto during the Civil Rights Movement, when white Southerners threatened violence in order to shut down civil rights marches. And the Supreme Court recognized that you cannot allow that to happen. And what the court concluded is that the responsibility of the city, the police, or the university in such circumstances is to take all reasonable measures to protect the speaker and to enable the event to take place, and that it can terminate the event only if it is impossible for it to prevent a clear and present danger of serious harm. But short of that, the heckler's veto cannot be allowed to prevail. Now, I should make one other important point about the strategy of disruption. It is counterproductive. What it does is to give the speaker and her ideas greater visibility, turns her into a martyr, and enables her to sell books, get on cable news, and promote her views more effectively than ever. People like Richard Spencer, Ann Coulter, and Milo Yiannopoulos were complete unknowns until they were made famous by violent protests against their views. Now they are household names and ever more sought-after speakers. As the Southern Poverty Law Center recently explained in a policy statement on the alt-right on campus, quote, "When an alt-right personality is scheduled to speak on campus, the most effective course of action is to deny the speaker the thing he or she wants most, a spectacle. Alt-right personalities know that their cause is helped by news footage of large jeering crowds, heated confrontations, and outright violence at their events. It allows them to play the victim and gives them a larger platform for their racist message. Denying an alt-right speaker of such a spectacle is the worst insult they can endure." So what the Southern Poverty Law Center wisely recommends, instead of that kind of disruption or violence, is that the best strategy for those who oppose the speaker's view is to hold an alternative event away from the alt-right event to highlight the campus's commitment to inclusion and our nation's democratic values. This response is the right one across the boards, whether the speaker is a member of the alt-right, an opponent of gay rights, a supporter of abortion rights, or any other speaker whose views one may oppose. Let me now return to my central theme. What is it that makes for a great educational institution? It is, I submit, the intense, strenuous, and constant intellectual activity of the place. Presented with many points of view, students must be compelled to think for themselves. At a great educational institution, the air is electric with ideas and questions, and it is from that environment that students derive an intellectual stimulation that should last them the rest of their lives. This is the true meaning of education. Your responsibility as a student is to test what you are taught at every turn, to challenge your teachers, your classmates, and yourselves, to choose your own values and your own beliefs. To meet this responsibility, you will have to be independent, you will have to be daring, you will have to take risks. It is not easy to tell your professor, who has devoted years, perhaps decades, to mastering her subject, that you disagree with her latest observation or theory. But the discourse of a great academic institution should be an incitement to risk and to boldness. If you find yourself hesitating, if you feel timid, If you wonder if it's worth it, think of the rebels in Abrams. At an age not much older than you, that is, the students, they dared to take on the government of the United States. You certainly can take on a mere professor. The faculty of a great institution of higher learning ask nothing of you that they do not ask of themselves. Even the most distinguished teacher and scholar routinely suffers frustration and failure. It's only by taking risks, by daring to ask questions no one has ever asked, that real contributions are achieved. Thus, if your professors ask you to take risks, know that they take risks as well. At an institution like Dartmouth, you should never forget that the only appropriate response to even the most withering question is not resentment, but gratitude. Fulfilling the responsibility of academic freedom means more than challenging your classmates and your teachers. It also means challenging yourself. It means being willing to reconsider what you yourself have come to accept as true. In 1921, after 2 years in prison, Molly Steimer, one of the Abrams rebels, was deported to the Soviet Union. It was not what she expected. Disappointed in the political and economic realities of the systems she found there, Steimer again agitated against the government, this time the Soviet government. Again, she was arrested, prosecuted, and convicted of sedition. In 1923, she was deported from the Soviet Union. I don't know this for certain, but I rather suspect this was an unparalleled achievement, to be convicted of sedition and deported within 5 years from both the United States and the Soviet Union. Whatever else one might think of her, Molly Steimer was not afraid to reconsider her positions. In 1919, a majority of the Supreme Court in the Abrams case rejected the bold approach of Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes and opted for a safe view of the First Amendment. 50 years later, the Supreme Court unanimously overruled the majority opinion in Abrams, and embracing Justice Holmes' dissenting opinion in that case, held that the government may not punish even speech that, quote, we loathe and believe to be fraught with death, unless that speech is both intended and likely to incite imminent lawless action. To reach this result, the court had to challenge the first principles of its predecessors and to overturn a half-century of precedent. A great college, like a successful court, must dedicate itself to the rigorous, open-minded, and unyielding search for truth. You'll learn here to ask the hard questions, but it's not enough to examine the premises, beliefs, and assumptions of an earlier time and find them wanting. It is too easy to dismiss those who thought that the earth was the center of the universe, that its resources were boundless, that only men should vote, that marriage is only for people of the opposite sex, or that separate could ever be equal. You must remember that you too hold beliefs that your children or your children's children will rightly regard as naive, foolish, perhaps even obscene. You must be prepared to challenge your beliefs to reform your world, just as the rebels in Abrams struggled to reform theirs. You too must challenge the nature of things. So to return to the question with which I began, where the hell are you supposed to be going? As you've no doubt surmised, your adventure has no predetermined path, no assigned destination. Let the journey engage you. For as the humorist Will Rogers observed almost a century ago, even if you are on the right track, you'll get run over if you just sit there. At an institution like Dartmouth, the faculty warmly welcome their students because students are where the future lies. From this place, you will take away an intellectual stimulation and curiosity that will last the rest of your days. As Justice Holmes mused in Abrams, quote, all life is an experiment. May your life's experiment be filled with curiosity, boldness, and courage. Thank you. So I'm told that we reserve the first 2 questions for students, and then it's open to even people my age. So I call on the students to ask some questions. Yes?
I was wondering, to what extent do you think disruptions and cancellations of speakers are just the effect of unpopular ideas having failed in particular, like marketplace of ideas? Because it's not as if the ideas are new when the speaker comes and presents them. Presumably the people protesting are protesting because they have already heard the ideas and have decided that's not something that we as a marketplace of ideas stand for.
Well, they don't have to stand for them. I'm sorry, yes. So I think,
Sorry, my question.
Oh, there's a microphone. I'm sorry, there's a microphone. Why don't you do it over again? I didn't know there was a microphone.
I was wondering to what extent disruptions and cancellations of speakers are just the effect of unpopular ideas already having failed in a particular marketplace of ideas. Presumably because the ideas aren't new, they don't come into existence when a controversial speaker is allowed to come and spread them on a college campus. The students who are asking for the event to be canceled are doing so because the idea is already out there, and collectively they've decided that it's not something that they want to participate in. So that was my question: to what extent are the disruptions just effect of the free exchange of ideas already working and having decided those ideas have failed?
So the simple response is, who decides that certain ideas are good or bad? What Holmes talked about, and what I think the principle of free speech and academic freedom assumes, is that we should always be open to challenge all accepted wisdom. The same thing would have been said about gay rights, about women's rights, about slavery, about African Americans, about separate but equal. We don't need to talk about that, right? We know what the right answer is. It's settled in our society. That's exactly the recipe for disaster. And the problem is, if I think I know the right answer, I'm no better or worse than the people who in the past thought the things that they thought were the right answer and shouldn't be subject to any further discussion. So the answer is that there needs to be an understanding of humility about your own certainty, and there needs to be an understanding that other people can express views that challenge what you believe to be true, and your response should not be to silence them, but to answer them, to respond to them, to explain why they're wrong and why other people should reject those views, but not to prevent them from conveying them. Because the whole point of academic freedom or freedom of speech is that people should be allowed to challenge the accepted wisdom, because the accepted wisdom, as we've learned, is often wrong. Second student question. Over here? No, okay, sorry.
My question's in regards to the Harvard scandal where 10 students were rescinded for engaging in private conversation that was seen as immoral. I was wondering if you agree with their decision to rescind the students, and if yes, how do you mitigate its chilling effect as a dangerous precedent for future students to be scared to post their unpopular political views? And if no, what do you think the appropriate course of action was for students who obviously encouraged violence against certain minority groups and other subjugated groups?
So if I understand, I don't really know the details of what happened at Harvard, but tell me if this is more or less accurate, that students who'd been admitted, the university then discovered that they had engaged in online discourse that was racist, sexist, and the like. Is that a fair characterization? Okay. And so first thing to note is that there's a difference between how you deal with faculty and students who are part of the community and people who want a job at the university or people who want to be admitted. So that is a distinction, number one. Number two is that one of the things you can take into account appropriately when you're either hiring faculty or admitting students is character and judgment. And if you believe that a person has a character because of their behavior that suggests that they would not be an appropriate member of the community. Let's suppose you're looking at a faculty candidate and you discover that they are racist and sexist in their interactions with other people, right? A university would realistically, and I would say fairly, say that's not somebody we want to invite into our community. And I think the same is true for prospective students. Now the key difference here is it's not about opposition to ideas, right? And it's a hard line sometimes to draw. But if people express ideas that themselves are stated as ideas, and the university says, well, we don't want anybody here who holds those beliefs, I would say that's not appropriate. But if what they've engaged in is conduct, even if it's in the form of words, that shows them to have a particular character that makes them unpleasant, potentially unpleasant as people, as fellow classmates, as dorm members, as colleagues, then I think that is an appropriate thing to take into account. It's not an obvious, easy line to draw, but I think that is a critical factor that you have to look at in that situation. And from what I understand, and I don't know the details of the Harvard situation, it seems to me that that falls more in the category of behavior that is immature and stupid and offensive, and not because of the ideas that they were expressing as such. But I don't actually know the details. Yes, over here. And after this one, the old people can ask questions too.
So you briefly mentioned chilling, and I have had the chance to read another article of yours where you discuss it more in depth. And I was wondering, with respect to social media, how do you think the chilling effect could be amplified based on content neutral and content based interactions of free speech on social media? And how do you think the future of the Supreme Court will look with dealing with cases on social media, specifically cases that they deem content neutral, which you claimed are more suspicious and should be scrutinized heavily?
So actually, you got it backwards, but
Oh, sorry, yeah.
right. So you mean how can chilling effect not be amplified, but how can it be reduced?
Yes.
Right. And you mean content neutral regulations are more acceptable than viewpoint based regulations?
Yes, sorry.
Yes. So if I understand the question, it's are there ways of addressing some of the problems that arise on social media by regulations that are neutral with respect to content?
Correct.
It's hard for me to imagine how you would do that. It's the content that is objectionable in this content. So content neutral regulation is something like no one can use a loudspeaker after 9 o'clock at night in a residential neighborhood. Doesn't matter who the speaker is, it doesn't matter what the message is, it's neutral with respect to content. Under First Amendment law, content neutral regulations are regarded as more acceptable than regulations that explicitly disadvantage particular points of view. So if you said no Republican use a loudspeaker in a residential neighborhood, that would clearly be unconstitutional. A law that said no one can use a loudspeaker after 9 o'clock in a residential neighborhood probably would be okay because it's more neutral. It is neutral. It's hard to see how neutral regulations would affect this because what's being objected to is the content. Now, on social media, it's an interesting question that we're now seeing where institutions like Facebook and others are beginning to try to exclude from Facebook messages that they find to be inappropriate. And that poses a really interesting question. So a newspaper or a magazine is perfectly free to decide what it wants to publish or not. So if you send a letter to the editor to the New York Times, they can decide whether to publish it or not, whether they think they like the point of view or they don't like the point of view, and it's their First Amendment right to decide whatever they want to do. On the other hand, they are held legally accountable for anything they publish. So if they publish something that is libelous or that is obscene or that invades privacy, not only is the author liable, but they are liable as well for having chosen to publish it. Okay, organizations online have been given a certain distinctive kind of immunity by federal law that treats them as what's called common carriers. That is, what the Congress basically decided some years ago is that we don't want Facebook and all the like censoring speech because of a fear that someone will post something that they could be held liable for, right? Because there's so much of it, it would be almost impossible to monitor it all. And then if you actually held Facebook liable for anything that somebody chose to post that was libelous or obscene or invaded privacy or whatever, they would go out of business. They just couldn't do it, right? So because of that, the law gives them immunity from liability for anything that's on, let's again say Facebook, that you post or I post, unlike newspapers and magazines, right? And now what's happening, though, is institutions like Facebook are beginning to engage in screening and removing material. And the more they do that, the more they begin to look like a newspaper or a magazine. And the more, and the less credible it seems to give them this immunity that other publishers don't have. So there's a real problem in trying to figure out how much insulation online providers should have from material that they allow to be published once they begin to actually screen stuff and exclude some stuff. But the bottom line is I don't think any content neutral rule would be effective at regulating this. On the other hand, holding them liable for material that is otherwise actionable would have a significant effect. The problem, it would probably have such a significant effect it would put them out of business, which is what you don't want to do, right? So finding a middle ground is really complicated.
Thank you.
Yes, back there, either Dan? Oh, you, I'm sorry. This is inefficient.
Do you have any thoughts on the idea of a university committing, say, $500,000 per speaker to ensure adequate security? Is that a reasonable amount of money?
Ideally, that should not be necessary if the community does not engage in disruption and in violence, so they shouldn't need to do that. How much money the university should have to spend to defend academic freedom is complicated. But the bottom line is, it's a critical value of a university. And if you turn over freedom of speech and academic freedom to potential disruptors, you've basically given up your university. Because then it goes beyond speakers, it's classes, right? If a bunch of students don't like the subject being discussed in a class, they now begin disruption and they threaten violence. I'm going to kill the teacher. They do it anonymously, of course, so you don't know who they are, right? So now you have to spend all this money protecting the teacher. You need secret service for your faculty members, right? So the problem is the more you give into this, the more of it there will be. So part of the argument is that the investment of the resources is a way of discouraging people from actually acting in this way because they don't achieve their goals, right? But as soon as you begin canceling speakers, you then just encourage more people to do the same thing. You then basically turned over your university to whoever wants to shut it down whenever they want to shut it down. So the hope is that investing those resources to protect when there really is a danger is a way of mitigating the heckler's veto problem. And because they don't achieve their goal of preventing the talk. But obviously there's a certain point at which you bankrupt the university. And even the court would say that the heckler's veto at some point has, as I said, given in to compelling interests. But the real problem right now is universities tend to want to avoid the problem in the first place. So they just cancel the speaker without even thinking seriously about what they'd have to do to protect the speaker and whether there's really a serious risk of violence. Obviously, we've seen some instances in Berkeley, for example, in Middlebury, where there's been serious disruption and violence. And more protection, at least in Middlebury, would have helped to avoid that. I don't know if it would have helped in Berkeley. But the bottom line is canceling the speaker is a last resort. And there may be circumstances where the danger is so great and is so real that you can't realistically, I said reasonable measures. So a certain cost, if you really can justify the fear of serious violence, it may be okay to cancel an event. But you can only do it in a situation where you can demonstrate convincingly that this is so out of your control that you really have to do so. And I think what's happened is most institutions have been too quick to do this, to avoid the issue. But you're right, paying the cost is a problem. And what I would say is institutions should have to pay it up to a certain point. But so far, they haven't done that. So far, they haven't actually done that. Yes.
Do you think it's the obligation of a university to hire faculty members who have dissenting
to what?
voice?
I missed the last phrase. It's the obligation of university to
hire faculty members who have dissenting voice, disagree with majority of the faculty members. For example, would your university hire a professor like Charles Murray, the bell curve author, and people like them?
So I think one of the things you want to create in a university environment is a diversity of perspectives and views. And one of the problems that conservatives, and I'm not a conservative, but one of the things that conservatives have rightly identified about higher education these days is that it's dominated by people who are more or less on the left. And that's, I think, an accurate statement, and it's been demonstrated by all sorts of perfectly reliable data. I think that's a problem. I think that I want to hear from people who disagree with me, and our students should hear from people who take different perspectives. And one of the interesting questions is why this has come about. So conservatives say it's because liberals got control of universities and now they discriminate against conservatives. I think it's actually much more complicated than that. There's no doubt that there's an element of that, frankly, but I think it's also much more complicated than that. But I do think that universities should seek that ideological diversity, and in the same way that they seek other forms of diversity to enrich the culture and the debate and the discourse of the institution. Now, would the University of Chicago hire Charles Murray? I mean, I don't know enough about the quality of Charles Murray's scholarship to answer that question. But I would like to think that the university would hire him if they believed that the scholarship was at the level that we aspire to at the University of Chicago. And we certainly have plenty of faculty members who are very conservative. Maybe not as many as ideally you should if you want a truly diverse institution, but we have plenty of faculty members in my law school and throughout the university who are very conservative. And so I don't think that's a bias as much as it is a problem. Sure.
Professor Stone, could you say something about the difference between presidents of private schools versus state schools in terms of their legal obligations, commitments, responsibilities when this kind of question comes up?
So public institutions are governed by the Constitution. They are parts of the state, and the Constitution governs state action, but only state action. So Berkeley, as a public institution, has to comply with the demands of the First Amendment. The University of Chicago or Dartmouth, which are private institutions, do not. We have absolutely no constitutional restraint on our freedom. The Constitution only regulates government. Therefore, a private institution can simply say, to hell with the First Amendment, we don't care at all about it, and to hell with academic freedom, we don't care about it. And they can say, we're a university that is only for conservatives, or only for liberals, or only for people of a particular religious faith. Whereas a public university cannot do those things. Now, almost every college or university in the country has come to the view that, as Harper said in my earlier remarks, that if you do not aspire to achieve academic freedom, you are not a university. You are not an institution of higher education. You are General Motors. But you're missing the core fundamental value of what makes an educational institution a university or a college. But nothing in law prohibits them from doing that. You could create a university that's just for conservatives, and that's perfectly okay, or just for liberals, and that's okay, and you don't have to abide by any legal constraint, as long as you're not misleading anybody in your contracts and so on. It's a pure contract question. But there's no legal constraint on a university in that respect, on a private institution. But the interesting thing is virtually every college, university in the country has the same aspirations about academic freedom. But they have come to understand is if you don't aspire to this, if you don't try to live up to this ideal, then you're really not achieving the goals of what you purport to be.
Next question. How can it be ethical for a college or university to give a platform to someone who is bigoted or a neo-Nazi or a white supremacist when that view silences the views of some of its students?
It shouldn't silence the views of those students. I know that there are students who will be angry and be upset and be even traumatized by that. But if that's the rule, then you can't have people speak about all sorts of things. And I think that universities have to basically help students who feel silenced by this speech, as Barack Obama said, not to be silenced, and to learn how to do that. Because again, in the real world, once you get out of college, nobody's going to protect you. Nobody's going to protect the students. And if you're going to be effective citizens in the real world, you've got to learn to cope when you have people who say things that are offensive and racist and sexist and homophobic. And that's just the reality. And universities, in my view, fail to meet their responsibilities to their students if they don't help them learn how to do that.
Okay, so my question is related to Carlos's, and I kind of half wrote it out, so I'll start and then I'll go off into it. But I think that part of a healthy culture of free academic discourse is respect, of course. And I think a problem for students whose voices have been historically suppressed is that they're accustomed to hearing viewpoints from students who have had historically more social power and whose viewpoints take up more space in public discourse and culture. And then I think it's difficult to hear the arguments for free expression phrased in a way that puts more responsibility on students whose viewpoints have been historically suppressed and who have thus learned to respect others just inherently. to hear that it's their responsibility to just develop the right sorts of tools to combat that. Of course, there's a responsibility to do that, but I just wonder if we could frame it in a way that puts more responsibility on those who haven't developed a culture of respect and listening to other viewpoints, especially from those people that they've historically seen as below them.
I think the answer is education, but I don't think it's censorship.
Yeah, I agree, but like even at Dartmouth, we have programs for incoming students where they're educated about sexual assault, and there'll be a group of like 10 students, and there'll be a mediator, and they're asking questions like, what will you do if you see somebody who looks like they're being preyed on in like a bad way? And then you'll have students who are not used to these sorts of discussions who will like laugh it off and disrupt those sessions. So it's just that people have already learned not to respect any other viewpoints, even already. So it's like even these educational sessions aren't that for students who need it most. And I wonder if there's a way to like hold them more accountable for that without suppressing their right to speak as well.
Well, first of all, I think you underestimate the capacity of people to learn and to change their minds. If you take a longer view and you look about changes in society, about attitudes, about racial discrimination, gender discrimination, discrimination against gays and lesbians and now transgender persons, there's been remarkable change based upon openness and discussion and debate and visibility. And it's true that in the short run, it's hard. But the way you get to the long run is by continuing along that process. And so the question you're asking, I guess, is, what can you do to people who don't share the right values to get them to share the right values?
Yeah, and that being the value of respect for other people's opinions.
Well, I think, again, you educate them to that effect. When they behave badly, you can talk to them. You can educate them. If I have a student who I think, for example, has, in any context, behaved in a way that I think is unprofessional or inappropriate, I will sit down with them and say, I'm not going to tell you you can or can't do this, but you're a jackass. And everybody knows it. And this is not how we get ahead in the world. And I think this is the way people learn, and it's the way they change. And I think it doesn't happen overnight, and it's something one has to work towards. But I don't think you can sort of make a list of the people who you think have the wrong ideas and make them go to a special class. That is for the people who have ever said something inappropriate or whatever. I don't think that's going to be a workable solution to the problem. But at the same time, friends can tell them, you're a jerk, knock it off. You're just making a fool of yourself. And that will change people's attitudes. I've seen this with, as I said, race, and over my career, I've seen this with race, and I've seen it with gender, and I've seen it with sexual orientation. And people do learn. They're capable of learning. Attitudes in this society can change. But it's a struggle. It takes time. But I'm actually fairly optimistic about that over time. And in the short run, I think the reality is that you can't pull a couple of people out because somebody thinks they might not have the right attitudes about something and force them into a situation where they're going to be brainwashed. I don't think that's going to work. Yeah.
Hi, Professor Sloan. Thank you. So you've spoken before about how, in effect, the First Amendment doctrine in the United States has been built backwards. Not moving from philosophical theory to doctrine to results, but rather from intuited results backwards to doctrine, and that the court has ruled on multiple cases in this kind of backwards order of explanation. And so my question to you is what you think the role of intuition or intuited results is for cases that pertain to free speech, and especially free speech on campus.
So I think what you're referring to is the first time a court interprets something like as vague as Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech, right? Which tells you nothing, right? In his opinion, a year or 6 months before Abrams, Holmes basically gave the famous hypothetical of the false cry of fire in a crowded theater to demonstrate that the First Amendment can't be taken literally. Obviously, it's not meant to say that the person who falsely cries fire in a crowded theater is protected by the First Amendment. But then the question is, well, what does it mean? Right? What is the freedom of speech? What does a bridge mean? Right? Well, the reality is that when you first start looking at that question, you don't know the answer. Right? It's not self-evident. And so what courts tend to do over time is to learn from experience and from their mistakes. And if there's a way of having an objective interpretation that is persuasive, that's very helpful, but it's almost never there. And so, in the cases involving World War I, the majority of the Supreme Court basically took the view that this is wartime, and speech that's critical of the war or of the draft will lead people to turn against the war, will lead them to refuse induction into the military, may lead soldiers to be insubordinate, might encourage the enemy to believe that we'll quit the war if they stay in long enough. Those are all harmful effects, right? We're not about to say that those harmful effects are protected by the Constitution because, frankly, we don't know anything about free speech right now, right? So that's why it took 50 years for the court to get to where it finally overruled those decisions unequivocally and adopted the Holmes position. So now I don't know if I've answered, what was the last part of the question? Have I answered that?
Yeah, just I guess specifically on college campuses, but
Well, on college campuses, I think the Supreme Court has dealt with college campus issues for a long time. I mean, there are a lot of Supreme Court opinions that are all consistent with the approach that I've been enunciating. So, in a high school, for example, back in the 1960s, in a case called Tinker, a high school punished a student for wearing a black armband to protest the Vietnam War, and the school prohibited it because it would cause disruption. It upset students whose brothers may have been in the military, may have been fighting in Vietnam, and so on. And the students were suspended, and it went to the Supreme Court of the United States. And the Supreme Court said, no, you have a right to wear the black armband and to protest, at least unless, in that context, you can demonstrate substantial disruption that actually has a clear and present danger of that happening. And in universities, for example, the University of Virginia refused to fund student organizations that published materials that advocated religious beliefs. It said that under state constitutional law, we have an obligation to avoid supporting the establishment of religion. And so student publications can support whatever they want, whatever views they want, but not religion, because that interferes with our obligation not to be involved in the establishment of religion. And the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. That violates the First Amendment rights of those students. Even though you have this commitment to non-establishment, that's not strong enough to justify discriminating against students who wanted to speak in this way. And there's other cases involving students who use profanity and other students who oppose the war and oppose communism, and faculty members who oppose communism, in which the court over time has come to say universities have to abide by the First Amendment. But it is something that evolves over time. Think of the court's views on gay rights, right? So in 1986, the court confronts its first case on gay rights. And in a 5-4 decision, it says that gays can be punished for engaging in sodomistic behavior. And 13 years later, in Lawrence v. Texas, it says it overrules Bowers v. Hardbeck, the earlier case, and said it's unconstitutional, right? And then 10 years later, it holds the constitutional right to same-sex marriage. Well, if you'd asked the Supreme Court in 1986, it's your constitutional right to same-sex marriage, they would have said, what, are you crazy? That's insane, right? But you learn over time. And the same thing is true for constitution. And hopefully you learn the right lessons over time, not the wrong ones. Dan here?
Earlier, you referred to the standard of fire in a movie theater and speaking more broadly about the First Amendment.
False cry of fire.
False cry of fire in a movie theater.
False is important, yes.
Okay. And so it seems the justification for preventing that is that it will cause distress by the people, and they'll believe that there's a fire, and they'll have to leave the movie theater and have a stampede and cause a lot of danger. What about other phrases that can reasonably be assumed to carry imminent danger, such as like a loud Allahu Akbar in a crowded movie
what?
theater? Allahu Akbar.
I don't know what that means.
It's basically what an Islamic suicide bomber would say before
Okay.
pressing the button on their vest.
The first thing about the hypothetical that's critical is it's false, a false statement of fact, right? Which is not the same thing as a true statement, or just a statement of opinion, right? That's what makes the hypothetical so clearly correct, right? And the harm that Holmes is talking about actually was based on a real situation that had happened about 6 months earlier in New York, where someone falsely yelled fire in a crowded theater and a bunch of people were seriously injured as everyone tried desperately to get out and trampled each other and so on. So it had a clear and present danger element to it as well, and serious harm. So if somebody yells that in a movie theater and it's false and everybody is going to scramble to get out of the movie theater, it would be the same thing if it's a false statement. If it's a true statement, then of course you can punish him for the bomb. You don't need to punish him for the speech. But if it's a false statement of fact, it would be the same as the false cry of fire in the crowded theater.
Thank you.
Sure. Down here?
I think just on that point, to elaborate a little bit, Allahu Akbar means Allah is the greatest, which in itself doesn't really have a negative connotation, but based on situational stuff, it could have that negative connotation. So what would be your stance on that? Because it could go either way.
Right. So that's interesting. I mean, in that context, it would not be the equivalent of a false statement of fact. And the question is, would it create the clear and present danger? In fact, so if yelling that had the effect of causing people to panic and rush out and trample each other, then the question would be, can you punish a true statement of fact that creates a clear and present danger? Interestingly, initially, the Supreme Court said any speech that creates a clear and present danger of grave harm can be punished. More recently, it has basically said even that's not permissible. That unless the speech itself is of low value under the First Amendment, like a false statement of fact, right? You can't punish it even if it creates a clear and present danger. But that's ambiguous. So the hypothetical is a really good exam question, frankly. There's not a simple black or white answer to that hypothetical. If the speaker specifically intended to create the riot, then probably you could punish him. If the speaker yelled that because they were simply making a declaration and did not specifically intend to create the riot, you probably couldn't. Oh, want to pass it down this way? We've got time for maybe 2 more questions.
Take it. Okay. So I wanted to go back to something you said about how people shouldn't feel silenced, and I do think that's true that they should work to develop a way to not feel silenced. But so there's like a lot of modern philosophy out there that argues that like it's the climate that's created by hate speech that silences people. So say like pornography. It creates a climate where, yes means no, and that silences women's ability to consent. Like if they say no, and I take that as yes, then it's really not on them, it's on me. So isn't it a university's obligation to create like a climate that's, I don't know, good for learning and whatnot? Like if a bunch of students complain that a professor is racist, doesn't the university sort of have to, isn't the university obligated to at least examine whether or not those students have a fair shake in terms of grades when that professor's proclaimed to be racist? I'm sorry, that wasn't a well-formed question.
Well, obviously, if a faculty member is racist, is discriminating against students on the basis of race or religion or gender or sexual orientation or whatever, they can be fired for that. If they're perceived to be racist or sexist, then the question is, well, why are they perceived to be that? If they are saying things that create that impression, then certainly the faculty member should know that they are creating this difficulty. And then you'd want to have a conversation to figure out, is there a reason they're doing this that furthers the academic mission or the educational mission, or are they just being racist or sexist or homophobic or whatever? I do think that in the classroom, there are restrictions that a university can place on both faculty and students in terms of what they say that they could not apply to the university community in general. So when the University of Chicago report talks about speech that is directly incompatible with the core functioning of the university, a faculty member who in class is gratuitously making racist or sexist or homophobic comments that aren't directly part of the course that he's teaching, they could be called in and said, knock it off or get out of here.
But along that justification, couldn't you cancel a speaker who you perceive to be racist or is racist?
No, because I think the difference there is that that's not in a classroom setting. The student doesn't have to go to that event. You can avoid it if you want to. The person not speaking on behalf of the university. So no, I don't think it's the same thing.
Thank you.
Sure.
I'm going to bring it all the way back
Okay.
over.
This is unfortunately the last question.
Hi.
Hi.
So a lot of the past couple questions seem to deal with the broader relationship between speech and action. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the relationship between speech, action, and then the establishment of something like an unsafe social practice, like the relationship between a racist comment versus behaving a certain way towards a race versus the establishment of racism inside of a group of people.
You have to be more specific.
So
In the law school world, we live with hypotheticals. So.
correct. How about an alt-right speaker? So a speaker who identifies as a member of the alt-right might have some sort of beliefs that marginalize a set group of people. By itself, that act of hate speech might not be something that the college would want to immediately dismiss. But if that alt-right speaker were to then perform actions or if students were to attend the talk and then for the speaker to not take questions from a student based on their race, that would be an action that is actively discriminatory. Yes. And then if other students were to see that or listen to the talk with speech coupled with the way that the speaker behaves towards others, that could lead towards the establishment of a social practice that we would condemn as something bad, like active discrimination. So
look,
could
speech can have, this goes to a lot of the questions recently. Okay, so first of all, the action of discriminating between students is different from ideas. And actual discrimination is can be constrained, clearly. So first thing I want to make clear that I am not in any way unsympathetic to the challenges faced by students and people in our society who have backgrounds, experiences that creates particular challenges for them. That's real, it's important, it's fundamental. And I do think that universities and our society has to take those things seriously and try to figure out ways to address them. But I don't think censorship is the answer because censorship, I think, opens the door to a nightmare. I think those who demand censorship now do not understand what they are inviting. They will win tomorrow and they will lose for the rest of their lives. That's the key naivete about the demand for censorship. But I do think that that does not mean that we do not have to take very seriously the challenges that are faced by students and colleagues and others in a world in which there is homophobia and racism and sexism and the like. So that I think is critically important. The other thing I think is important is that in the university communities, this goes back to the earlier question about liberal dominance, right? The university community is about as safe a space as exists in the United States, right? The vast majority of people in the university community are sympathetic to the concerns of gays and lesbians and women and Muslims and African Americans and so on, immigrants and so on. You're never going to be in a place, frankly, that is as supportive in its general overbearing attitudes than this. The people who really are truly deeply marginalized in the university community are the people on the other side, evangelical Christian students, who can't say what they think, frankly. They're the ones who really are silenced, and don't even want people to know who they are, right? And that's a real problem as well. But I think the fundamental takeaway, right, from all of this is censorship is dangerous. And it is a special mistake to think that you can control it once you open the door to it. You can't. That's a lesson throughout history. And the practical reality, as I said in the talk, is that once you allow censorship, for the most part, it's exactly the people who are now demanding it who will lose over time. Once you legitimate it, it's going to come back against you. And that's not something you want to do. And the other thing is that for an academic community, the fundamental ultimate value is not to be telling people that can't say things that you don't like or offend you or upset you. And you don't have to go, you don't have to listen to it. And you have to learn how to respond, how to argue your position. It's hard. It's harder for some people than others. Clearly that's true. One of the things I learned when I went back over the past year or two and talked to some of my former African American students from 30 years ago and some of my women students from 30 or 40 years ago, and asked them, were there times when you felt really uncomfortable, unvalued, when people said things that upset you? And they said, yeah, it did happen. And I said, did you tell anybody? And they said, no, we just thought it would be awkward and people would look down on us. We'd seem whiny. And I think it's really important that people are now speaking up and saying these things and forcing universities to think about these issues, which they haven't thought about. And they're hard issues. And it's going to take time to figure out what are the best ways of managing them. But I think it's a very positive thing that our institutions are beginning to understand the challenges that exist among our community. But I don't believe that censorship is the solution. And again, to come back to the final point I'll make is I think that the real world, once you get out of here, is not like this one. It's not a place where 90% of the people basically are supportive and sympathetic to the views you hold. It's a world that elected Donald Trump, right? That's not this community, frankly. This community, if it voted, would not have elected Donald Trump, right? But that's the real world. And having to cope with it and to deal with it and to be effective in it is critical. And universities fail you as students if they don't give you the power and the means to do that effectively. And that's, I think, critical for us now. And I think we understand now that there's a new challenge we hadn't been aware of. And we've got to embrace it and understand it and help work with you to address it. Thank you all very much.